And welcome back to Masters of Modern. I'm your host, Michael Grothy, and I'm here with Yair Villanueva.
That's me.
Alex and Ben are both in Germany, and so I'm taking over the cast. And I have brought local Jund expert, Yair, and we're just going to chat about Jund.
Gonna Jund them out.
Yeah.
It's my specialty. It's what I do.
What's your Magic background?
So,
just to give the viewers an idea of who we got on the show right now.
All right. So I started playing Magic around Return to Ravnica, but never really got into it until like Dragon's Maze, where I was playing more casually with friends. I started playing Commander at a local shop, and from there sort of branched out into trying to play Modern. I think my first, quote, Modern deck was Mono Red Blitz with Monastery Swift Spears and Kiln Fiends to just get them. From there, I tried building Affinity, never really liked it. Was building Grixis Twin on the broke high schooler budget, which took a very long time and got banned when I was like 80% done with the deck. So,
yeah, that's the argument against bans, right?
Yep, I have lived and breathed the entire banned deck out from under you. So it is what it is. I started playing Control and played that for most of my Modern career until I finally slowly pieced the Jund together and have been in love with the deck since. And yeah, that's like mainly what I play now.
Awesome. Just a reminder to viewers out there and listeners to like and subscribe to this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast if you're listening on to the audio. Support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the MMcast. That's how we make the show. So I guess the big news for Jund right now is that a Jund deck just top 8'd Austin through like a big field of nasty Okos and Urzas and everything else.
I can get into that. First and foremost, we want to sort of just lay the groundwork for what Jund is as a deck for viewers and listeners who
let's do that.
know what that
let's
is.
do that. That's better.
So Jund is a mid-range strategy that uses black, green, and red cards. And it tries to leverage all of their cards into disrupting your opponent and sticking a threat in order to close out the game. You're looking to, at the bare minimum, trade your resources 1-for-1 with your opponent. So casting spells like Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize, which discard cards out of your opponent's hand. Lightning Bolt to just kill something. Fatal Push to just kill something. And then on the higher end, you want spells that will 2-for-1 and sometimes 3-for-1 your opponent. So Kolaghan's Command, which is a modal spell that blows your opponent out most of the times. Bloodbraid Elf, which you can cascade into pretty nasty threats. Liliana of the Veil, which can stick and make your opponent's life pretty miserable. And because of it, the deck ends up being pretty customizable, I think. There was a joke going around the SCG circuit a couple years back where the commentators were talking about how one of the Jund players that made it into like top 16 or top 8 probably agonized over the 1 or 2 ofs of his deck, but like that's where Jund gets its percentage points. You're trying to maximize that. And so I think Jund making the top 8 through the recent Oko Menace isn't really that surprising, outside of the fact that your Tarmogoyfs become 3/3s instead of 5/6s or 4/5s. But you can tailor your sideboard hate pretty well, so everybody's on Collector Oofs and Alpine Moons for the big mana matchups and the artifact matchups. Fulminator Mages if you still want to do that and synergize it with your Kolaghan's commands. And Spell Bombs because you expect graveyard decks like Dredge, and sometimes if they're overpowered enough, like Hogak was, you just jam 4 Leylines and call it a day.
Yeah, everybody was jamming 4 Leylines back then.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, Jund has a reputation of being like the big mid-range deck where like you are trying to have an okay matchup against everything. I feel like every local meta has like at least one Jund guy.
Yep, that's me.
And do you think that kind of like the ability to constantly tweak the deck and shave a Kolaghan's Command here, add a 4th Bloodbraid Elf there, you know, put a Liliana of the Last Hope in the main, put your Tireless Trackers in the side or in the main or in the whatever, like is that kind of what keeps people playing Jund?
Yes, definitely. Jund is a deck that's like always there and always wants to be fine against everything. So when you're fine against everything, it all comes down to just pilot error. And the best way to sort of work your way around that is jam a million games against every single matchup possible. Make sure you tailor your sideboard to whoever you expect to play against. So recently, Primeval Titan decks have been on the huge upswing with Dryad of the Elysian Grove being printed, Uro being this pretty good utility spell for them that sort of ramps them and stabilizes them against aggro decks. So Now you see Jund decks playing Stone Rain in the sideboard, which is a tech that Reed Duke was on recently.
Interesting. So why Stone Rain over some of the other options like, I don't know, Fulminator Mage or Molten Rain?
Right.
Or
So Stone Rain has the added benefit of hitting basic lands, which Fulminator Mage does not. Stone Rain, for those who are unaware, is 2 and a red for a sorcery that just destroys target land. And being able to hit their...
classic alpha card.
Oh, yeah. Being able to hit their snow-covered forest or their regular forest and cutting them out of 7 different land names for their Field of the Dead is a way that Jund can sort of claw its way back into winning the matchup after a Primeval Titan resolves or something.
Interesting. How do you think that Jund is positioned right now? I mean, is it always just like doing what it's doing? Because there's been periods of time where like Jund is the best deck, or Jund is one of the decks that you really want to be watching out for, or you really want to be playing it.
So
where would you put Jund in the meta right now?
I think currently Jund is a little bit below fine. Traditionally, the big mana decks are a huge nuisance for Jund because you have no real way to stop them from executing their game plan. So the biggest offender...
Other than Stone Rain,
exactly. The biggest offender of that was Tron, and still is Tron. You can discard their threats out of their hand. You can blow up their expedition maps and whatnot. But if you don't have a threat and a way to close out the game pretty quickly, they just rip whatever big top-end threat off the top of the deck. And after assembling Tron, every top deck is basically live. And I think primetime decks have a very similar strategy in that they have this inevitability that you can't really outpace in the long run, so you're trying to disrupt their initial line of play before trying to close out the game. That being said, I think with the huge uptick in Primeval Titan decks, Jund is pretty well equipped to sort of tailor their 75 for that. So you could throw in Stone Rains into the sideboard. If your local meta is super big on big mana matchups, you could main deck Fulminator Mages if you really need to.
Yeah, I mean, Fulminator Mage is okay in quite a few matchups.
Yeah.
I've played some Fulminator Mages and been happy with it. Yeah, I mean, Fulminator is cool because you can also get it back with Kolaghan's Command, or if you're playing Liliana the Last Hope or something like that. That's why I was wondering why Stone Rain. But I guess, yeah, with the rise of snow-covered lands post-Modern Horizons, I guess a lot of people are just not relying on non-basics as much.
Yeah, exactly.
I know when Field of Ruin got printed, it was kind of like these mid-range and control decks had a much better chance against Tron because you can keep them off of Tron using a land and like it doesn't cost you a card.
Right.
Do you think that like Jund is able to make use of Field of Ruin, or is that more of like a black-green rock card, or what's the difference?
I think that's more of a black-green rock card. So Jund is actually very tight in the way its mana base is constructed. You want to be able to have black on turn 1 in order to be able to cast a turn 1 discard spell. There's also some argument to be made to have red on turn 1 so you can cast your lightning bolts as well. Which is why Blackleaf Cliffs makes its way into the deck. Although, hand in hand with that, you want to be able to play a turn 2 Tarmogoyf if you need to. So you want to be able to have green, or I guess nowadays you want to be able to turn 2 red and 6 and sort of pick up your fetch lands and keep your engine going. So you want access to red and green by turn 2. And taking it a step farther, you need double black for your turn 3 Liliana of the Veils. So your mana base is already pretty squeezed on creating specific colors of mana. Occasionally you see Twilight Mires being played as a 1-of to sort of smooth that out. Raging Ravine is the man land of choice because it taps for either red or green, and sort of foregoing your turn 1 in order to be able to play that is not as bad. I have seen some Jund lists playing Ghost Quarter. I know Reed Duke himself has tried it. I've tried it. I personally don't really like it. It's sort of this cute little engine with Ren and 6, but when you have a turn 3 Liliana of the Veil that you like need to cast in order to win, and you're stuck on black mana because you drew your Ghost Quarter, it just feels really bad.
So why Ghost Quarter over Field of Ruin? I mean, it feels like you're not willing to go down a land. I mean, mid-range decks, especially Jund, tend to be pretty mana hungry. Like you want to be casting your 4-drop Bloodbraid Elves, plus you have a stream of card advantage.
Yeah.
So like you want to be able to play Kolaghan's Command, get back Tarmogoyf, and play it in the same turn, or you want to be able to activate your Ravine. Like it feels like you don't want to go down a land.
Yeah, that's also that line of thinking is also why you don't really want to play Field of Ruin. You not only sort of go down a land in that you trade a land with your opponent and you guys both get something out, but you go down 2 mana for doing so. So that'll prevent you from double spelling, which once Jund gets to be able to double spell, it's a lot stronger. That's around the point of the game where it starts to stabilize. So if I'm able to, for example, play a Tarmogoyf and hold up a kill spell for my opponent's turn, or play my Tireless Tracker, have a fetch land in play, and be able to represent the threat of creating a clue, but also revolting a Fatal Push in my hand or something of that sort, it becomes a lot more difficult to attack.
So you're saying Ghost Quarter, not that good?
No. Well, I personally don't like it. I know there's somebody who plays at our LGS that is all about it and thinks it's fantastic. But I think you forego a lot in order to be able to play a colorless land that may or may not help you, especially when you already have access to stuff like Assassin's Trophy that can hit lands anyways. So,
oh, that's true. I remember because it was Field of Ruin, and then like a few sets later, they printed Assassin's Trophy, and everybody's like, "Oh, Jund is never going to have problems with Tron again." And it wasn't really true, I guess. But
I think that's the case every time a new Tron killer in quotes gets printed. That was Alpine Moon. That was Blood Sun when that was spoiled.
Oh yeah, Damping Sphere also.
Damping Sphere actually does kind of help, especially pre-Mox Opal ban with all of the crazy paradoxical outcome decks running around. Granted, they have 4 main deck engineered explosives, but being able to sort of slow them down for a turn so you can stabilize and disrupt their game plan was a pretty good way to go.
Well, yeah, now there's in more so in Pioneer, but there's the like Lotus Field Underworld Breach deck, and Damping Sphere kind of hoses them on two different axes. Yes. They can't like go off and cast all their spells, and they also hoses their Lotus Fields.
Yeah,
Jund is like a pretty expensive deck, and it a lot of times will take people a while to get all the pieces, because a lot of the pieces are just like great cards that are staples in Modern anyway. You got Thoughtseizes and Fetches and Tarmogoyfs and Lilies. And what advice would you have to any of the listeners who might be putting Jund together, or, thinking about taking that leap towards Jund?
Right, yeah. So I briefly joked before this to not build it. It's only half joking, honestly. Playing Jund requires a lot of time and effort in order to learn the matchups inside out. When you're casting your turn 1 discard spells, you kind of need to know what is the most threatening thing in your opponent's hand, and a lot of the time that isn't super obvious. Like in the case of casting a discard spell against your opponent who's also on Jund, you want to like get rid of their discard spell so they don't hit something out of your hand, but there's also, I don't know, like a Dark Confidant that you can't really kill, a Liliana that you know is just going to tear your hand apart and kill you off your threats. So it's all very contextual. In the same vein, you just want to put in a lot of practice into Jund. If you haven't yet bought anything, proxying is probably your best bet. Just proxying and jamming games with some friends, making sure it's a deck that you actually enjoy playing and want to put in the time to learn. And then from there, just snagging good deals, honestly. Like being on the prowl for people who are trying to sell Tarmogoyfs or Lilianas at slightly cheaper than normal
Tarmogoyfs
rates.
are pretty low right now.
That's true. That
they're not as much of a big player in Modern right now.
Yeah. Fatal Push definitely quelled it, as well as Oko. Why would I pay 2 mana for a 5/6 when I get a 2 mana 3/3?
Yeah, I mean, that could be said of any creature. At least Tarmogoyf's pretty inexpensive.
Yeah, that's true. And then taking it a step farther, you definitely just want to pick up lands first, because if on the offhand you decide halfway through building Jund that you don't really like the deck, or you don't think you're going to do well with it, you then ended up only spending your money on lands, which can pretty feasibly go in anywhere else. Or if you play other formats like Legacy, Vintage maybe, although if you're playing Vintage, you probably don't have trouble building Jund. And Commander, your fetch lands and shocks and whatnot could pretty easily just slot into any other deck.
Yeah, Jund seems like a deck where you want to give yourself a lot of decisions, but anytime you're giving yourself a lot of decisions, there's a lot of like wrong choices you can make, right?
Definitely.
So I guess I see what you're saying about how it's difficult to play and it kind of takes a lot of practice.
Yes.
Do you want to say more about that, or give us some tips and tricks for playing Jund?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of them, and well, a good handful of them don't really come up now. It's all, again, contextual based on what's at your local meta and who's on what deck and what your exact 75 is. Although there are some pretty notable things that you can point out for a very long time. And I guess now it's going to be a little more relevant with Heliod combo being a deck that people are trying. persist as an ability on cards like Kitchen Finks. They do hit the graveyard for a brief moment, and you want to be able to activate your Scavenging Ooze when they're in the yard so they don't come back and get increasing value out of it. So there is a bunch of small interactions like that can definitely swing the game in your favor. For a very long time, Surgical Extraction was a mainstay in your sideboard, usually as a 2-of, 1 or 2-of. And just getting into the habit of surgicaling your opponent after they draw. That way you have a chance of blanking their draw step. That's also a lot more relevant in something like the Tron matchup, because occasionally you'll be able to kill off one of their lands and you want to be able to cut them out of Tron for the foreseeable future. That way they're stuck playing the fair game with you. So being able to surgical them at the end of their draw and they just happen to draw that same exact land.
Oh, yeah, kind of like, kind of like if you have instant speed discard like a Vendilion Click or something, you want to hit them on their draw step. And yeah, I guess the fact that Surgical Extraction can sometimes just Thoughtseize your opponent means you want them to have as many cards as possible. I guess that's just like a general Surgical Extraction trick.
Yeah, exactly.
That people should be doing if they're playing Surgical Extraction.
Yeah, a lot of the small tips and tricks can sort of apply to other decks, and they're very card dependent. But I think Jund is probably the deck that can capitalize on it the most, since they're looking to maximize each card's potential at every turn of the game. So another example would be being aware that the Revolt keyword on Fatal Push reads a permanent leaves your field. So if you're against like a Mono White Taxes or an Eldrazi Taxes opponent and they Flicker Wisp your Tarmogoyf, you can then cast your Fatal Push and Fatal Push their Flicker Wisp or their other 3 or 4 drop that might be causing you some trouble.
What can a player do if so? You know, I don't want to play Jund, but I want to beat Jund.
Okay.
Is there anything?
Play Tron.
So just the big mana decks.
Yeah.
That's the way to beat Jund. If there's a Jund player just like beating up your local meta, just play a big mana deck.
Yep. And that big mana decks are notoriously difficult for Jund to navigate because they have that sort of inevitability engine that I talked about earlier. You'll see if you look at deck lists now from like recent Magic Online 5.0 dumps that a lot of Jund sideboards are playing 2 Alpine Moons in order to be able to get around that. And so just bringing any sort of big mana deck makes it very difficult for your Jund opponent because it sort of forces them to think about the game very differently. Any super low to the ground aggro deck also makes life very difficult for the Jund player. Burn is a very swingy matchup and has actually produced one of the more entertaining games, at least for me, because you have to know when to kill your opponent's Goblin Guides and Monastery Swift Spears, when to Thoughtseize, when to hold your discard spells back, whether you should play out a Tarmogoyf or your Dark Confidence or whatever, or decide to hold up interaction. And a lot of it sort of just comes down to your opening 7 and probably the top 3-4 cards of your deck. Usually if there's a Collective Brutality or 2 in there, you can stabilize pretty quickly. Without it, life is a lot harder. And then I realize backtracking now, tips and tricks for Alpine Moon. Mm-hmm. That card is super sweet. I do highly recommend any Jund pilot slot some into their sideboard if they're having trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think Alpine Moon in particular is a card that, because of the rise of Primeval Titan decks with Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and also it being like the best deck that didn't get banned.
Right.
Yeah, Alpine Moon tips and tricks, I think, are going to be welcome for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. The big one against Tron, and I keep dragging this back to Tron because our LGS has had like a 75% Tron meta for a very long time. And
that's a lot of Tron.
I'm the fool who thinks, oh, that's a fine Jund meta, and I'll just sleeve up Jund and be on my way. Alpine Moon, as I learned through repeated error, when you're against Tron, you want to usually name Urza's Tower if they haven't played it yet, because it cuts them off of being able to, quote, top deck 3 mana.
Sure.
In the sense that they'll spend their mana in order to kill your Alpine Moon, and then they play their Urza's Tower and have access to 3 more, as opposed to 2 or 1 if they weren't able to get rid of your Alpine Moon. If their Urza's Tower is already in play, you want to name an Urza land that you haven't seen yet. That way you don't immediately give them the green mana to cast a Nature's Claim and kill off your Alpine Moon. So it sort of staves them off for a turn or 2 in order to be able to get rid of it and get their engine back online, which in that turn or 2, you might be able to swing the game pretty heavily in your favor through like Collector Oofs or another threat.
So I guess blue-white control is also known as kind of a Jund killer.
Yes. Oh, well,
is that, would you say that that's still true, or has Jund evolved, or has blue-white evolved in a direction that makes it more favorable for Jund?
For a brief time, I think they were pretty on par with each other. it all just came down to pilot error a lot of the times in terms of
they're both
how the
very
gameplays
skill
would
intensive
go.
decks.
Yes. Those have also produced some of my favorite matches ever played on Jund, just because of how swingy and crazy the games can get. Post Modern Horizons, I think the matchup was skewed a little bit in Jund's favor, just because you got access to Ren and 6, which then gave you a sort of inevitability engine for playing the long game. You could stabilize on your mana, be able to activate your Rage and Ravines till the end of time because you've used your Ren and 6 to pick up your lands and grab every land out of your deck. By grabbing all of your lands, you then are only mostly drawing your good cards. And then you'd get to ult your Ren and 6, which meant you could recast all of your Kolaghan's commands, which are back-breaking for the control decks. You could recast your Lightning Bolts to give yourself some reach and kill off their Planeswalkers. However, now I think the matchup might be a bit more even again. I actually haven't gotten to play the matchup post Stoneforge Mystic unban, because locally, if I'm not on Jund, I tend to be the person playing Stoneforge Mystic.
Sure.
So I have not been on the Jund side of that.
What kind of Stoneforge Mystic deck are you playing, out of curiosity?
Currently, I'm on Bant Blade, even post Oko. Shout out to McWinsauce on Magic Online. He's usually like trophying with Stoneblade decks. I highly recommend you check out his lists if that's a deck you're interested in. Recently, he's been splashing green just for Icefang Coatls and an Uro in order to sort of stabilize you against the aggressive decks, which I think
Icefang definitely holds the sword pretty well.
That it does, yeah. Also, to my surprise, he's playing the new Theros Beyond Death Elspeth, just because it can create two bodies that can also just hold swords, which is sort of like the ground floor of what your threats do in that deck. But I think post Stoneforge Mystic, the matchup might be a little bit back to even. Kolaghan's command is notoriously strong against any sort of artifact, and the 2 toughness Stoneforge Mystic, because then you could just kill it and shatter their artifact that they put into play. Or my personal favorite has been respond to the activation and make them discard a card and kill their other X2, because they'll only have 1 card in hand and it'll be the equipment that they just tutored up. But I think you definitely need a lot of practice to get into any of those matchups.
Jund is just a very practice intensive deck, you would say?
Definitely. I still definitely make a ton of errors when I play Jund. A lot of it has been just because the metagame has shifted, and some of the heuristics that I said earlier, for example, about like naming the Tron land you haven't seen with Alpine Moon, may not still stand against Primeval Titan. I have not gotten to play that matchup post Oko ban.
So. Well, I guess they don't have like Tron. They just have like a couple of lands that are really important, Field of the Dead or Valakut, and the fact that like sometimes they're going to want to go for one and sometimes they're going to want to go for the other. And yeah, I could see that getting pretty complicated. I guess Dryad of the Elysian Grove is probably not a huge problem for the deck because you can kill it pretty easily.
Yeah, you can.
4 toughness is a pain.
Yeah, that's another thing that Ren and 6 definitely helped with once it was slotted into the modern Jund deck. Helps you kill X4s with your Lightning Bolts.
That's true, yeah. Ren and 6 can do some backup.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Field of the Dead kind of is the bigger threat, I would guess, for you, because you can get rid of Dryad, and a lot of the Titan decks right now are just playing Zero Mountain. They're just playing Valakuts for with Dryad.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would probably start off by naming Field of the Dead in that matchup before doing anything else. Field of the Dead is extremely difficult for Jund to deal with when you're 1-for-1ing all of your removal spells, and on their turn they make 4 2/2s.
I mean, we've talked about it as like a card that I think should be on like a modern watch list for getting banned, because it takes decks that are looking to play a slower game like Jund or like Control, or even any deck that's looking to trade 1-for-1 with the opponent. Like Field of the Dead just goes way over the top of everything.
Yeah,
and that's one of the reasons that it got banned in Pioneer and in Standard, is because it was like reducing diversity a lot. And the reason that like Field of the Dead went instead of Golos, for example, because Golos wasn't really the problem in Standard. It was the fact that like you could never go long against a Field of the Dead deck without playing Field of the Dead.
That's true. I do think, that being said, Modern and the card pool in Modern has a lot of an easier time dealing with Field of the Dead, between the room to be able to activate your Field of Ruins and your Ghost Quarters that you may or may not be playing, Your Assassin's trophies can hit it.
An Alpine Moon.
Yeah.
Blood Moon even.
Yeah, that is true. I did recently see a Jund list, I think like top 32, one of the online challenges that was skewing its build to be able to play 3 Blood Moons in the main.
Wow, with the mana problems that you were talking about, turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Ren and 6, turn 3 Liliana.
It's rough. Pre-Bloodbraid Elf Unbanned, there was a time where I was playing 2 Blood Moons and 2 Goblin Rabble Masters in the side, just to be able to get under all of the big mana decks, because you didn't really have a way to do that.
Rabble Master does seem well positioned. I mean, it's good against a lot of the big mana decks, right?
Yeah, that it does. That being said, I don't think I would recommend that build 99% of the time. It can definitely be pretty rough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes Thoughtseize into Rabble Master can just win a game, right? You take their 1 removal spell, here's Rabble Master, and then, I mean, Rabble Master is just a card that's known for single-handedly winning games.
Yeah, Army in a can.
Yeah. So Theros Beyond Death just came out, and we have been kind of talking about its impact on Modern. Dryad of the Legion Grove obviously has come up a bunch in this conversation because it's like such a huge meta player. But has Jund gotten any new tools from Theros Beyond Death? Is there anything in Theros making an impact there?
Potentially. I am pretty excited to try out Kroxa, maybe as like a 1 or a 2 of. Kroxa? I don't know how you say it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. The Titan, right? Yes. The red-black Titan.
Yeah. I think at face value, a 2-mana discard spell that also bolts them is pretty strong.
So it's red and a black. When it enters battlefield, sacrifice it. 6/6.
Yeah, sacrifice it if it has not escaped.
If it's not escaped. And then when it enters the battlefield or attacks, target player discards a card. If they discarded a non-land card, they lose 3 life. Or if they didn't discard a non-land card, they lose 3 life?
Each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life, yeah.
Got it. And then it has escape 5...
4. So escape is red, black.
Right. Escape red, black, but it's exile 5 other cards.
Oh,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
I think at face value, discard spell that can potentially lightning bolt them is pretty good. I do think the downside to the front half is that you don't get to choose what they discard, so they'll just discard the worst card in their hand, which does kind of suck on occasion. Although if you couple that with another discard spell or a Liliana of the Veil uptick, it makes your scenario a lot better, especially on turn 3. So if you discard into Tarmogoyf, into the front half of Kroxa, and then another discard spell, it's probably pretty difficult for your opponent to sort of bounce back, especially in the face of a Tarmogoyf that might be like a 4 or 5 at that point. The back half I do think is a lot more tricky. You kind of want card types in your yard in order to be able to grow your Tarmogoyf and make it a hefty boy, and having to exile 5 other cards can sometimes be a bit of a problem. You kind of have to keep in mind what card types your opponents have in the grave, what card types you have in the grave, if there's any overlap, anything that only you have, that way you're not accidentally shrinking your Tarmogoyf. And I guess now that we're in this line of conversation, it is worth noting that the damage that is dealt to your Tarmogoyf will stick around and always be there until the end of turn. So if you shrink your Tarmogoyf on the turn that it took 3 or 4 damage and you put it in lethal range, you will accidentally kill your Tarmogoyf. So it's something to definitely be watching out for. Yeah,
that's true. There's definitely been Tarmogoyf and Tassiger, Gurmag Angler builds before, and I'm sure many people have been burned by that.
Yeah, I was recently playing a Rug Delver list with 4 Tarmogoyfs and 4 Hooting Mandrills, and I had to be very careful about the way I delved. So.
Yeah, that's true. This is basically a delve card. It is interesting that it does kind of grow your Tarmogoyf, though. Like in a matchup where your opponent isn't going to have a creature in the first few turns, this puts a creature in your graveyard, which is interesting. Right. Like if you go, Thoughtseize into Tarmogoyf into this, then it like puts creature in graveyard, which might not be easy to do depending on the matchup.
Yeah, definitely. Also, occasionally you'll just hit some pretty hard to create card types out of your opponent's hand. So Artifact has been a notorious difficult card type to have hit the yard. Although now with Urza, it's a little more prevalent and grow your Tarmogoyf by a lot. Planeswalker is another one if your opponent's sort of on the back foot and doesn't think they'll be able to cast their Jace the Mind Sculptor or Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Having them discard it does give you a pretty difficult card type to achieve. And if there are any black-white tokens players in your area, maybe they discard their Bitter Blossom and give you both tribal and enchantment.
That's true, yeah. I was playing, when I used to play Eternal Command, spell snaring Bitter Blossom always felt great because it made my Tarmogoyf freaking huge.
Yeah. Biggest it can get is 8/9, correct?
Yeah. I think I had an
have played
8-9 at
some-
least once.
I have played some 8-9 Tarmogoyfs.
And it's typically because of Bitter Blossom.
Oh, yeah.
Although there are, Tarmogoyf lists that sometimes play Tarfire.
That
so
was
you
the
can
Rug Delver list I was playing recently.
build your own,
Tarfires.
build your own Bitter Blossom, I guess.
Yeah.
Any other Theros cards? Crocs is the big one.
I think Crocs is definitely the big one. Not a Theros card. However, I do want to test a little bit more with Seasoned Pyromancer. That's a card that's like sort of bounced in and out of the 60 card main deck for Jund. At face value, it sort of powers through your deck and helps you get to the one-ofs that might be really good in the matchup you're in, and can sort of resculpt your hand to throw away the one-ofs or two-ofs that are terrible in the matchup you're in. So if you're against Burn and you're looking at a hand of Thoughtseizes, being able to create 2 bodies or I guess 3 total bodies and throw away 4 damage to yourself is pretty good. Although on occasion it can be not as great if your hand is in a decent state for the matchup that you're in or the state that you're in, and you need to cast something that can block / attack. Having to cast your Seasoned Pyromancer and discard some of those cards is pretty hurtful. So
Seasoned Pyromancer, it does a lot. It also like stocks your graveyard if you're playing Croxo or a Delve creature or something, or it can put some coveted type. You can discard a Liliana to it or something if you have a second one to get the Planeswalker in your graveyard. Yeah, I was really impressed with Seasoned Pyromancer in Vintage Cube, actually. I was playing ton of Vintage Cube when it was legal. And yeah, like Seasoned Pyromancer doesn't seem like it stands up to the format, but it just like did a lot of small things. I mean, in that environment, it was like sometimes discarding my Reanimator target, but fueling your graveyard is relevant because you have all the Delve cards, but you don't just get to jam a ton of fetches. And so it did a lot of like hand sculpting and stocking the graveyard and like creating chump blockers both on the front half and the back half. Like when it dies, you can just instant speed make more.
That is true.
To stay alive an extra turn to, do your thing. Or chump block for your Liliana, I guess, in a modern context.
Yeah. Chump blocking for Liliana is huge.
Yeah.
I guess I should also now backtrack once again to Liliana and some Liliana tips and tricks.
I like Liliana tips and tricks.
Yes. I think the big one is to be very conscious of the cards you've seen your opponent in previous discard spells before you play a Liliana. And being conscious of them moving forward. I just mentioned that I played Rug Delver recently, and I think it was playing in the finals against Jund, and my opponent was hellbent, had a Liliana with 1 counter, draws for turn after I pass, and they play the card that they drew, which was a land, in order to uptick and have 0 Liliana downside, in quotes. Unbeknownst to them, I had a Brazen Borrower in my hand and was able to just bounce the Liliana and force them to discard it, which felt pretty good and felt pretty good for me and very miserable for him. And that's something that you definitely want to be aware of, especially since Brazen Borrower, I think, is a pretty notable player in both Modern and Legacy at this time. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think like having a main deckable bounce spell in these formats has changed kind of how you have to think about certain effects like Liliana.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is interesting. And like you were saying, like Kolaghan's Command, even where you can, I guess you would never be making yourself discard, but like being able to bounce something and then Kolaghan's commanding it, or
definitely. Kolaghan's Command was another one that players against Jund had to be very conscious of, especially if they had like a card that they knew they wanted to cast in that matchup. So in the control matchup, you'd have your cryptic commands that you want to protect, and if you were at 2 cards in hand, you kind of always wanted to keep it that way. If one of them was cryptic command, that way they couldn't just randomly Kolaghan's Command you at the end of your draw step or beginning of your draw step and force you to discard that 1 card that could potentially swing the game back in your favor. So it's definitely something to watch out for, I think, on both sides of the matchup. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the card. I've been playing it a lot in Standard. I've been trying to seek out decks where I can play Brazen Borrower, actually. It was the first Eldraine card I crafted on Arena. Okay. So my sweet. Yeah, I played a couple of different builds of Teamer Adventures, and I was playing the blue-red flash deck for a while. Okay. But yeah, I think it's great that it's starting to, get its due in Modern, among other formats. Yes, I do think the cool thing in Legacy is you can bounce your opponent's Merit Lage, which just made Delver matchups very entertaining.
That's true. So Brazen Bar we're seeing play even in Legacy.
Oh yeah, it's seeing a lot of play in Legacy. Being able to bounce Chalices, being able to bounce Merit Lages is pretty big.
Oh yeah, I guess it's 2 mana, so you can typically bounce Chalice, since Chalice is pretty much always on 1. That makes sense, yeah, because I know that Merit Lage was like a problem for those decks, and people were like
playing some pretty embarrassing cards to get around it.
Yeah, I mean, like
Snag in the Rug Delver sideboard.
Vapor Snag. Oof. I mean, at least Submerge is a little more defensible, even if you can play around it a little bit. So what else is new? What else is new with Jund? I mean, obviously Renin 6 is a big player. You were talking about Season Pyromancer. Is there any Eldraine stuff that's made its way into Jund, made a big impact? I mean, I always see Jund around and it always kind of looks the same to me, but I know that like a more experienced Jund player is going to look at these lists and see,
oh, that's a 2 of. Oh, that's a 1
of. See like the slight differences. But to me, it's like, yes, I recognize all these cards. This is a Jund deck. And I think that's how it is for a lot of people, because the deck's been around like literally since the beginning of Modern. I mean, it's basically like a standard deck that just kept going in every format and just is still around. And it's gotten some new cards that have become staples, and that's easy for me to recognize. But a lot of the subtle differences in Jund lists, when I see them around on Magic Online dumps or on GP top 8s or whatever, it's not... I feel like there's a lot of subtleties that I'm missing about the deck because it is such a subtle deck.
Right. Not actually an Eldraine card, but just the card quantities are always an interesting thing to look at, especially if you've been playing Jund for a while, because you get to sort of guesstimate what they were teching their card choices against. So Abrupt Decay, for example, is something that has seen a huge downtick in play. The control matchup, you kind of don't really have room to play your Abrupt Decays. Now it's a 1 of, maybe. Seeing it as a quantity anything higher than that, they're...
So that's interesting. I would guess that like with Oko being such a big player recently, and towards the end of Oko's life, there were just like Oko backed up with counterspells was kind of like the deck, the like Urza decks. It was like Abrupt Decay good then, or was it not doing enough there?
It was fine. It's just that Assassin's Trophy kind of did what you wanted to do and had the added benefit of hitting most of your other problem matchups as well. Being able to hit your opponent's Teferi Hero Dominator, your opponent's Urza's Tower, or
Primeval back to Urza's Tower.
It's just something that you always sort of have to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
I have played more than my share of the Tron matchup, and I know that matchup like the back of my hand.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that every local meta probably has a Jund person, and it's got at least one Tron person as well.
At least. Let's talk about
always
like 3,
playing
maybe.
Tron.
I did play Jund at GPLA this past year. Dredge was the deck to beat at the time. So I had...
Was it the Hogak?
I think it was right before Hogak.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was in like April. So it was right before Modern Horizons release, I think.
Wow, I had forgotten that Dredge was the deck to beat before Hogak.
Oh yeah, and then Hogak made it a nightmare.
What a world.
I was the madman taking Jund into a full Dredge meta, which, pro tip, never do. It's rough. I was on 1 Nihil Spellbomb in the main, which was the graveyard hate of choice for Jund, just because you can cycle it for another card after you Spellbomb someone's yard.
Yeah, it makes sense as a main deck inclusion because it always cycles. And there are certainly matchups where you want to get rid of their graveyard, but it's not worth a card to you, like Snapcaster matchups, or even definitely. Like the Mirror, or, where they have Delve spells. Being able to just like get rid of someone's graveyard without spending a card seems really valuable, especially in like a very resource intensive, not a deck where every resource matters a lot.
Yes, definitely. That's actually another thing. There was, when Grixis Shadow was the deck to beat, there was a weird little dance you'd have to do about knowing when to spellbomb them. If they had the turn 2 Gurmag Angler or turn 2 Tassiger, maybe, you needed to sort of be on the watch out for that. And,
right, because once they cast the spell, it's too late. Yeah, so you have to make sure you get them before they get a chance to cast their spell.
Exactly. I was also on the 1 of Kalitas in the main at GPLA.
It seems good against Dredge.
Pretty good against Dredge. Humans and Spirits were the other pretty prominent decks. So being able to turn your Fatal Pushes into zombies was also very, very good.
Yeah, and I've lightning bolted a prized Amalgam before, and it feels really bad.
It does feel awful.
Except, if you have a Cletus, then you get a 2/2. Yeah, exactly. There, you get rid of their Amalgam forever. I like that.
Yeah. I got to run into the Tron matchup, I think twice over the course of day one. I missed day two by the skin of my teeth. Played into Tron and felt very comfortable playing that matchup. My opponent gave me one of those looks when he saw what deck I was on after he played his turn one. Tron land into map, and I was like, all right, I've unfortunately trained for this. So I got to sort of use that knowledge to my advantage. I think post-Modern Horizons, Collector Oof is a very good card in the matchup. It's a beating, especially if they're on the draw, because your turn one discard spell may or may not leave them with an Expedition Map or an Egg, Egg being Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere, and then being able to follow that up with a turn two Collector Oof that sort of blanks their turn one plays.
And it puts pressure on them, which I think is that's the key to beating these big mana decks, especially Tron, is
disrupt in the clock.
Right, because if you just disrupt them eventually, and you surgical their land and you spend all these spells, ripping up their hand and Liliana plussing them and whatever, and they're just here's my sixth land, Wormcoil Engine, and you're like,
does feel bad. Ancient Grudge is another very good card for that matchup. Being able to Ancient Grudge them again when you're on the play and just take them off of map sort of disrupts a lot of their hands. Maelstrom Pulse is relevant because the Wormcoil Engine leaves behind 2 worm tokens that are named.
Oh wow, they have the same worm. That's pretty same name. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Not to mention, Karn and Ugin and some of the big non-creatures are cards that
so
can be tough to deal with without a Maelstrom Pulse or an Assassin's Trophy.
Yep.
We talk a lot on the show about how having experience with a deck that is really important. And actually, I think that's one of the big draws of Jund is you were kind of saying, oh, if you're thinking about building Jund, don't do it because it's a lot of work. But I think that work can be put in over the course of years. And Jund is always going to be a deck that you can play.
Yes, I agree.
I don't think it's ever embarrassing to take Jund to a tournament, even in a big Dredge meta or a big Tron meta or a big Oko meta, for example, where Jund is a dog. It can still put up results. And we always talk about there's these decks that are pillars of the format that even when they're not on top of the metagame, if you know the ins and outs of your deck, it can be a deck you can always play. And I think Jund in particular rewards that. Yeah, Burn is another one of these decks where you can always play Burn, and it's typically not totally embarrassing. I mean, the only time is I would say when Birthing Pod or Malira combo decks are the best deck. Maybe don't do that.
Don't sleep up your burn deck. Yeah,
but in general, it's a deck that you can always just expect to randomly top 8 something or.
I also think that's a pretty good heuristic to go by when you're customizing your Jund to 75. Sort of tie this all back to Jund. You have these pillars of the formats, and if you're going to an unknown meta, so if you're going to play at a local Magic Fest or you're going to play at a new LGS, you sort of need to respect the fact that these decks exist and bring Collective Brutalities in your sideboard, Collector Oofs, your Ancient Grudges, your Fulminator Mages. Just have them ready because you might be able
I know that you have a huge box of sideboard cards that you swap in and out based on what you're expecting to see.
It used to be a box, and now it is upgraded to a full playset binder, just because I had so many cards in my Jund box. They're now BGX box because I've got Lingering Souls in there. I've got other nonsense. If I ever see a list that I want to try out that's playing a spicy 1 or 2 of, I've got the spicy 1 or 2 of, most likely. I know for a while when Spirits was the deck to beat, there were a couple Jund lists going around with a 1 of Courser of Krufix and a 1 of Ishkana Graph Widow in order to make a bunch of 1/2 reach boys to be able to block all of the flying spirits. And so I've got those primed in foil and ready to go.
Never know when you're going to need your Ishkana Graph Widow.
Exactly.
I guess Plague Engineer is another big Jund addition recently too, right?
Definitely. Plague Engineer is insane against the tribal decks, so against goblins, against humans, against spirits. Yeah, it's just
it says destroy target tribal deck on it.
We have a local merfolk player, and every time I shuffle up against him post board and play my turn 3 Plague Engineer, he dies a little bit on the inside.
Yeah, at least Merfolk is a pump-based deck. Elves is the deck that really suffers from Plague Engineer because they don't have that many pumps in the deck. It just kills all their creatures. Merfolk, at least it's now my Merfolks are only getting +2/+2 each. Dang.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key in specifically the Merfolk matchup, getting a Plague Engineer down before they can get a Lord because it makes their life a lot harder.
That makes sense.
Then they'll have nothing to pump.
I feel like Merfolk, Jund is probably a pretty bad matchup for Merfolk in general.
It's a nightmare
and tribal decks in general, because they're looking to kind of leverage a critical mass of creatures to like get lords into play or get enough elves into play that you can go off with your heritage druid or whatever. And Jund is just playing a big pile of removal.
Yeah, Storm is a similar, and faces a similar problem against Jund. They want to have a critical mass of cards in their hand so they can go off and storm out. And they need their cost reducers through Goblin Electromancer and Baral in order to make that happen. And you can just Kolaghan's Command their Electromancer and 4-for-1 them virtually, because they're now down a combo piece. They're down their Accelerant. They're down a card on top of that. And it's a nightmare scenario for them. But backtracking back to Plague Engineer, so I got sidetracked there.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a cool card, and I would like to hear the tips and tricks.
Oh, yeah.
Other than play it against tribal decks.
Play it against tribal decks is definitely the big one. Keep an eye on your opponent's card types is the other big one. Vendilion Click has seen a huge downswing in play post Brazen Borrower, because Brazen Borrower, I think, at face value is less niche than Vendilion Click. But if you're against state control player who has Click in their deck, note that both Vendilion Click and Snapcaster Mage are both wizards. And you can name wizard and just totally blow them out of playing some sort of instant speed blocker or instant speed attacker. They can turn the corner and kill you after you've gotten pretty low off your Dark Confidants and whatnot. Keeping an eye out for scenarios where you might be able to kill an X4 by being able to lightning bolt after you named a card type is another pretty big one.
Dryad.
Yeah, Dryad, I guess, is now something we got to watch out for. Urza was another okay target for it. Although in the Urza matchups, you're usually naming Thopter or Servo to cut them off of their size or their Saheelis. Outside of that, just having a Death Touch 2-power blocker is pretty good. Sometimes in the mirror, you get to name their Lurgoyf and their Tarmogoyfs are 1/1 smaller, which actually does matter on occasion when you've got removal in your hand.
Yeah, the Death Touch on Plague Engineer is brutal. Yeah. I mean, it's not the obvious part of the card, but in creature matchups, it doesn't really matter what your opponent's is playing. Just being able to bring it down, all their stuff gets smaller. It makes their attacks bad. Yep. They have to attack into it and trade, and then you Kolaghan's Command it back or whatever.
Yeah. So in specifically the Jund Mirror, you could name human or wizard to cut them out of Dark Confidants if you've seen that out of their deck. I say if you've seen it because recently I think Dark Confidant has been a 2 of or a 0 of in Jund decks. So you want to be able to
with Modern Horizons was not very friendly to X1s because
that it was not.
Plague Engineer, Renin 6, Lava Dart. Although there's not a lot of Lava Darts, I do think Red Prowess is probably well positioned right now because it goes under the big mana decks and beats them up. And
definitely,
it's kind of gotten a critical mass of good Prowess cards like Lava Dart that it's kind of more popular than Burn, perhaps.
Yeah, that I can see. But in the Jund Mirror, you can name whatever card type their X1s are that you've seen. So in Dark Confidant's instance, human or wizard, and then just trade up with a 4/5 or 5/6 Tarmogoyf most of the time.
Seems good.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's also interesting that it's good against a lot of the one card engine things like Sai or Saheeli or Young Pyromancer or Lingering Souls. A lot of these cards, because they make a ton of tokens of the same type, you can just blow them all up at once, which is cool. Even though it's not a tribal deck, you're still killing 4 creatures for 1.
Yeah, and then also usually in those matchups, you have some cards that are really bad. So I guess when Urza was legal, your lightning bolts weren't great because both Sai and Urza were X4s. Sorry, when Mox Opal was legal, not when Urza decks were legal. When Mox Opal decks were the deck to beat. X4s make your lightning bolts very bad. Bring those out and then bring in Plague Engineers to stop your opponents from going super wide and making your life miserable, or more miserable in that case.
Yeah, no, I mean,
it's pretty good.
It's interesting that Urza decks don't seem like this is a card you would want, especially if they're not playing Thopter Foundry. But yeah, being able to name human, it hits Sai and Urza, and then you can finish them off with bolts, or you can name Thopter to get rid of Sai or Servo or whatever. The card has a lot of interesting uses that are not as immediately obvious as my opponent's playing a tribal deck.
Exactly.
So yeah, we've talked a lot about Jund, and I briefly mentioned Black-Green as the Field of Ruin Jund. What what do you think of like the other Jund variants, Abzan, Black Green Rock, Jund? I mean, Jund is kind of the one that's often been on top because of Kolaghan's Command and Bloodbraid Elf in particular. But
those are 2 elf cards.
But I mean, with Stoneforge coming back into the meta, there was some talk of like, Abzan, Jund Blade, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but
Abzan Blade. So I think a good heuristic to go by for those other decks. They're all under the mid-range umbrella, but they all sort of specialize in different things. Jund, I guess you could take as sort of the middle line for the purposes of this heuristic, and that's like the de facto mid-range deck. Abzan, I don't know how it is positioned now, as I haven't seen an Abzan deck in a very long time.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's mostly because the cards that were doing very good for it now are not. Siege Rhino is a little bit too clunky for Abzan players to be casting on turn 4, especially when you can just cast the Urza on turn 4, turn 3 sometimes. Lingering Souls notoriously dies to Plague Engineer, as we talked about briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the times where we've seen Abzan be as popular, if not more popular than other Black-Green variants, is when Lingering Souls is good.
Yes.
So if Lingering Souls is good in the meta for whatever reason, that's what you put in your Black-Green deck.
Yeah. And that is what actually leads me to this heuristic. Abzan is the mid-range deck you want to play when you want to beat other mid-range decks, because you get access to your Path to Exile in order to have like clean Tarmogoyf answers, your Lingering Souls to just chump your opponent's gigantic threats for days, and then Siege Rhino to sort of go over their top. Black Green Rock is the mid-range deck you want to play when you're a little bit worried about your life total. If the meta is particularly fast, your mana base is significantly less painful since you're playing less shock lands. You've got some more main lands. You have access to the full 4 Blooming Marshes. They're playing Field of Ruins as well. And you, I think now, or at least as of late last year, they were still up on 4 Assassin's Trophies. So it sort of just gives you clean outs to any giant threat.
So Black Green's good in like a burn or prowess or like aggro metagame?
Yeah, I can see that. That being said, there are some sort of pros and cons to playing both. Like if you play Black Green Rock, you lose out on being able to cast Lightning Bolt, which is just as good in those matchups, and can sort of represent a way to turn the corner on your aggro opponent if you're able to sort of bolt them on and step, untap, and then swing in with your threats, and there's this 3 damage that they didn't account for.
Yeah, true. I mean, and you also are losing, the rest of your face burn in the form of Kolaghan's Command and Bloodbraid Elf, which...
I think Bloodbraid Elf was also probably the other really big one. I know when Bloodbraid Elf first got unbanned, everybody, myself included, was pretty up on cramming your deck full of 3-drops in order to maximize your Cascade potential and being able to cascade into as many Liliana of the Veils and Kolaghan's Commands as possible. And Maelstrom Pulses, you're up to like 2 or 3 sometimes. And being able to, or not being able to play that 2-for-1 game and just randomly blow out your opponent, I think is pretty big. I am of the belief that Bloodbraid Elf is somewhat a necessary evil. The floor for it can be really, really, really bad. If you cast it and flip an Inquisition or a Thoughtseize and your opponent has no cards left in hand because you already did your deck's early game plan.
Fatal push with no targets or something. Playing a reactive deck with Bloodbraid Elf, a lot of times you're going to hit a reactive spell and there's nothing to react to.
Yeah. And then sometimes you just get the insane Bloodbraid Elf into Liliana of the Veil when your opponent has like an Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger in play or something crazy.
Yeah.
And you just get to totally blow them out. I guess with that on the table, something to keep in mind when you're casting your Bloodbraid Elf is how many fatal pushes you have left in your deck. Because if they have 0 creatures left in play and you have another threat that you can cast instead of Bloodbraid Elf, you might just want to hold it back, and that way you have less dead cascades.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like there's a lot of nuance to playing the deck. What about like blue Jund variants?
Moist Jund.
Moist Jund or Sultai. I mean,
Spicy Sultai, Grassy Grixis. Yeah, you've got these names.
No, I mean just like straight Sultai.
Oh, straight Sultai.
I mean, I think of that as kind of a Jund variant. Yeah,
I can see that.
There are Sultai decks that aren't like the Mystic Sanctuary Sultai decks or stuff like that. But I'm talking more like black-green with like Snapcasters in it or Jace in it or something like that.
I think I last played Modern Sultai before Jace got unbanned, and I was on a Nissa Steward of Elements in the main deck in order to get your Dark Confidant to hit you for 2 and give you this insane like late game threat. Now I think it's probably pretty decently positioned. you get access to your Mystic Sanctuaries if you want to regrow your like Fatal Pushes or some discard spells, or Drown on the Lock is another really big one. You get to Drown on the Lock your opponent, especially if you're managed to play Thought Scours and stuff of that sort. However, I do think if you're going to be playing a Sultai mid-range deck, so to speak, you're probably better off just playing 4-color Shadow. I think that deck is better positioned.
Yeah, so I'm a big Grixis Shadow proponent on the cast. Alex likes Jund. He likes kind of the classic, but I don't know.
I am 4-color. This is
I know. Well, I think
this is the new hotness.
I think I was kind of saying that if I were to build a mid-range deck right now, I would prefer to build Grixis Shadow to Jund. What do you think about the comparisons between the Shadow decks, but particularly Grixis being the most popular one, versus Jund as like the two big mid-range decks in the format, I would say?
So there is some pretty big trade-off, actually. I've played a little bit of Grixis, I've played a handful of Jund Shadow, and I've played a decent amount of 4-color Shadow, actually. The big trade-offs you get
That's Moist Jund Shadow?
Yeah, sorry, Moist Jund Shadow.
Yeah, okay.
Excuse me. The biggest trade-off you end up getting between Jund and Grixis for Shadow is how well you can sculpt your hand. Sometimes your hand in Jund Shadow is just awful. You haven't enabled Delirium yet, and your Traverse the Elvenwald is sitting in your hand laughing at you, and you can't really do anything about it. Whereas in Grixis Shadow, you can Serum Visions, you can Thought Scour away and sort of get there. And the back end of that is sometimes your cantrips in Grixis Shadow don't really hit anything, and you're just drawing through air, and you keep cycling, hitting Street Wraiths and Baubles and whatnot. Whereas in Jund Shadow, once you get Delirium online, you can tutor up whatever threat you need. You can grab your Shadow because it's going to enable you to hold up Temur Battle Rage. You can grab your Tarmogoyf because it gets around your opponent's Engineered Explosives on 1, for example. You can grab Street Wraith to just randomly pump your Shadow by 2 during combat. Yeah, there's some pretty big trade-offs. 4-color Shadow, or Moist Jund Shadow, as you so elegantly called it, does sort of meet some middle ground there. I think Once Upon a Time is one hell of a card. It's insane. Between 3 copies of Once Upon a Time and then your 4 Baubles and your 4 Street Wraiths, your deck is very, very consistent. And you can keep hands that you wouldn't normally keep in either of the other 2 Shadow variants because you have Once Upon a Time to smooth out your draws.
Yeah, I think Once Upon a Time is one of the best cards in Modern.
Yes, I can agree to that.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, being able to tap your Nurturing Peatlands that you're playing a 4 of in that variant of Shadow repeatedly in order to grow your Shadow. You have access to both Temur Battle Rage and Stubborn Denial, which I think are the really big draws from playing red and or blue in your Shadow decks.
Yeah, I agree.
Good. Yeah.
Kolaghan's Command is also good because you're so threat light in Shadow decks a lot of the time that like being able to rebuy your threats with like a flexible card that has other uses, I think
I can see
be important.
I think the metagame might have shifted into a space that's a little too fast for that to happen nowadays. I've seen most Shadow lists that used to be able to play Kolaghan's Command now aren't really, just because they have other cards that they want to cast instead.
I guess what I'm getting at is like what are the pros and cons of just playing straight Jund over some sort of Shadow deck, right? I mean, there's like various Shadow decks. I think Grixis being like the standard Shadow deck is kind of what I was using as a comparison. Okay. But like traditional Jund with Tarmogoyfs and Bloodbraid Elves and Lilianas and the whole thing we've been talking about versus a different kind of Thoughtseize deck like Grixis Shadow. How would you say that they compare?
I think they're all pretty meta dependent, and I guess also playstyle dependent. If you like something that's a little bit more proactive, Shadow is definitely up your alley. You're able to go discard spell into a very aggressive threat and not just like a beefy threat like your Tarmogoyf or something resilient like your Renin 6. However, you do feel a little foolish when you queue up against Burn and you like turn 1 cycle Street Wraith and fetch Shock Thoughtseize and you're down to 13 and your opponent goes turn 1 Goblin Guide. It does feel a little bad. However, Jund doesn't really have much of an easier time dealing with Burn. It's still fairly level. With Jund, you also don't have extremely polarizing matchups. Like I know for the Shadow decks, Humans is like virtually unwinnable. They Reflector Mage your Death Shadow, and the other one is stuck in your hand. They Reflector Mage the Grimag Angler, and it's stuck in your hand. You can Meddling Mage their Fatal Push, and because they play a 3 or 4 of, they just have no way of getting rid of your board. you go super wide, can block them for days, and it's kind of a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, go wide decks I know are good against Shadow. You don't have as many value engines as Jund, right? Like you're not playing as many Planeswalkers or Tireless Trackers or Bobs or Bloodbraid Elves, and so somebody who just goes wide and can like chump block your threats and go around you is tough.
I think my favorite moment as a Humans player was when I played against a Shadow deck and post-board went turn 2 Auriok Champion and a turn 3 Auriok Champion, and they just conceded on the spot.
Where's the Plague Engineer? Where's the Plague Engineer?
Thank God. Although I think Plague Engineer may have actually made that matchup a lot more bearable now.
Yeah, and I think in general, Humans has just kind of been a lot less popular since Plague Engineer got printed anyway.
Yeah.
Not to mention, like, the format was kind of degenerate. I think maybe, I don't really know what the Humans matchup against, like, the Primeval Titan decks is, but I can't imagine it's that great. So I think Humans is probably not super well positioned, but
I can actually see it being decent just because you have that disruption backed by a clock. You're able to like turn 2 Thalia.
I guess Meddling Mage is really good against Primeval Titan in particular.
Yes, you get to Meddling Mage them, and then you just lord your team and
I guess sometimes Meddling Mage coupled with Beat Them Up is that's what the deck's supposed to do. So well, thanks for coming on and talking about Jund.
No worries, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, viewers, if you liked this kind of like specific deck tech type of episode, let us know. Let us know on social media. Comment on YouTube. Comment on the podcast app of your choice. Let us know on Facebook or Twitter at the MMcast. Wanted to try something new with this episode since Alex and Ben were out of town, and just chat about Jund, a deck that we all know and love.
Oh yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
No worries. Happy to be here. Happy to help.
And thanks for watching / listening, everyone. See you next time.
This has been a production of Time Traveler Media, sending podcasts into the future.